Hi, can you guys hear me okay? Okay, cool. So just to tell you a little bit about myself. So yeah, I live in Maryland. I got my PhD here in 2010. I had a background before graduate school in political polling, survey research, market research, working on campaigns. I have a really bad track record of working for Democratic candidates who either lost big or had a lot of promise and had to resign for scandal. So not a great track record, but had experience in surveys and polling and things like that. And so when I was here, I was involved in the CIMEP research group, but I also worked for the University of Wisconsin Survey Center, if anyone has done any work with them, because I had this polling experience. So what I want to do today is walk you through some of my core research areas. And we're actually going to focus a lot on political comedy and entertainment because it's fun and everybody loves when I talk about funny stuff. But I also do work on public opinion, and I'll share a little bit about that with you, and also public engagement in science. And all my public engagement with science work is with colleagues who were here for grad school, either at the same time as me or just shortly thereafter. And so, it's been 14 years, I guess, since I've been here, and we're all still friends and we're all still working together, so it's a lot of fun. But this work is across methods. So I know some of you guys are probably quantitative folks. Some of you might be qualitative folks. I do everything from quantitative experiments to large-scale surveys to qualitative textual analysis. And I'm going to try and show you an example of each so you get kind of a flavor of how you can approach this kind of work. And so my work is really driven by a series of core research questions. So number one, can entertainment media impact knowledge, engagement, and issue advocacy? And all the stuff I'm going to talk about today is how we can use media narratives to make our world a little bit better, right? And to make our public sphere a little bit more engaged. In the area of public opinion, it's what narratives can shape opinion to advance a more tolerant public sphere. And in the area of science communication and public engagement with science is how can we use humor to make science more accessible and engaging for the public so that more people participate. So first, let's talk about political comedy and entertainment, and I want to focus on a recent experiment. So how many of you guys were stuck at home during COVID and not going to school at some point? Good, bad, terrible? Right, pretty terrible, right? So I have two kids. At the time, my youngest was in kindergarten when he got sent home, and he didn't go back a year later until he was in first grade, which is it's pretty awful to go to school in your parents' basement no matter what age you are, but it's really bad when you're young. And so when he finally went back, the excitement was, now at the dinner table we get to talk about what you learned at school for the day. So he goes back to first grade, and I said, what did you learn at school for today? And he said, I learned that if there is a lockdown drill and I'm in the bathroom, I should stand on the toilet and close the door and be really quiet. And here I was so excited for him to go back to school, right? But I'm realizing that part of going into a school building is one of the first things you need to learn, right, is what to do if there's danger, right? Especially if there's a school shooting, right? They don't tell them school shootings when they're in first grade. They call it a lockdown drill. And so this is kind of the state that we live in when we go to public school. And, I know this isn't news to you, but more school shootings than days in the year in 2023, right? So this intractable public policy problem, right? And we haven't seen as much movement as we would like on the national political level. So this is the congressman from Lewiston, Maine, who realizes after the shooting happens there, maybe I should change my vote, right? But we haven't seen real national political action on this issue. But where we have seen engagement is from political comedians. And if we can't rely on our politicians to help us with the gun control issue, can we look to political comedians to broaden the issue debate? So I did an experiment, and I looked at, I don't know if anyone has seen Jimmy Kimmel's monologues about the Uvalde school shooting, if anyone had seen that online, right? So he gets really personal, and he removes the audience from the theater where they're filming and uses there's some jokes, but he's also pretty serious, right? But he uses his experience as a parent to talk about what it's like to send your kids to school and to worry about school shootings. And what I wanted to understand is if you expose people to this personalized political comedy, can it broaden the issue debate? And so I know you guys are from a broad range of disciplines, but I was looking at things like psychological engagement. So do people identify more with Kimmel? Do they feel a connection with him or a parasocial interaction, like a kind of fake relationship? And do they feel transported into the message? And also, does it make them take the message more seriously? Are they less likely to discount it? Are they more likely to elaborate and connect it with other things that they know? And do they find it informative? And so I did an experiment. And what I did was I had some people watch Kimmel's monologue, where he talks about Uvalde, right, his kind of serious but personal monologue. Some people watched that, plus he had about 2 minutes of clips from Every Town for Gun Safety that he also shared with viewers. And then I had a control group watch just a regular monologue from the day before this all happened, right? And what I found is, so I compared the conditions, and what I ultimately found was that Kimmel engaged people who don't normally pay attention to late night comedy. So the people who don't watch it very regularly and who don't find it kind of useful in terms of learning. And so those who watch less actually engage more, right? And it's possible, I don't know what I just did. Whoop. Okay. So those who actually watch late night comedy less regularly and have a lower affinity for entertaining news, or less likely to feel like they learn from comedy, actually engage with Kimmel more when they watch this personalized political comedy. What I also found is that the effects of comedy were greater for those who have a low affinity for entertaining news who watch late night comedy less. So he's broadening effectively the issue debate for gun control by having people watching his personalized monologues. And so you also see it with message engagement. So people who don't pay that much attention to comedy but saw the Kimmel clips were actually less likely to discount the message, more likely to find it informative, and more likely to connect it with the things that they know from other sources. And so the idea was that perhaps personalized political comedy can encourage greater psychological and message engagement effects among non-viewers. When people who don't normally watch comedy or rely on it for information actually stumble upon these personalized monologues, it gets them to think more about the issue. And if we can't rely on our politicians, maybe we can have our comedians help us understand why we should engage with particular debates like the gun control debate. So really, like, a lot of my projects come from kind of bumping into an important piece of political entertainment and wanting to understand how it's affecting others. So as broad as things like gun control and personalized political comedy and Jimmy Kimmel, right? And here's a project. I was able to publish 2 papers on it. And the suggestion is that if we can't rely on our politicians, maybe we need to look at other sources to engage people on the debate. And it's really part of a whole line of work that uses experiments to understand the different effects of exposure to different types of political comedy. So I've looked at everything from gender and whether it matters if the comedian is male or female. I've looked at the conflict in the Middle East. And I've also looked at what happens when SNL makes fun of a news program like The View, right? Does it change perceptions of the value and quality of the program? I want to talk to you about another political entertainment and comedy project. This one uses text to kind of analyze the program. So has anyone ever watched Last Week Tonight with John Oliver? It's a really popular show, right? It's probably the most informative of the political comedy programs. It's more of a news magazine program, right, where you get a lot of information on one story rather than a show that mocks the news or just brings on entertainment folks as guests. And so what I noticed, so one of the other things besides having my kids going to school in my basement is that I spent a lot of time watching television during COVID. Anyone else watch a lot of stuff, right? Binge watch, all sorts of things, right? And so I found that I was watching a lot of political comedy, in part to stay sane, right, and to make me laugh about what's going on in our world, but also for information. And what I started to notice, and this has been kind of an historic thing for John Oliver since his show began, is that he often asks people to do something small. Like you might remember back, gosh, it's about 10 years ago now, when the FCC was debating net neutrality, he told people to go to their website, and he sent so many people to their website that it crashed. This idea that he asked his viewers to do things. And so I wanted to understand what happens when we are recruited to do things and to donate money from a comedian rather than, say, a party official, right, or a community leader, or someone who is traditionally designed to get us engaged on issues. And so usually John Oliver takes on a new issue each week. I think he did Medicaid on Sunday night. Before that, he did food delivery services. He's done some stuff on school loans recently. But during COVID, he had at least 9 episodes that talked about some aspect of COVID. And his idea was, we really shouldn't necessarily be on the air or we're broadcasting from home. And what I really should be doing is trying to get as much money as I can towards COVID-related causes. And so what he does is that he starts to request small donations for things like food banks and other organizations from viewers of his show. And so what I actually did is because I had a lot of time, I looked at all 55 episodes that aired during kind of like the core of the COVID pandemic. So when he first goes and broadcasts from home in March of 2020, all the way through to November 2021. And I also looked at, sometimes he posts stuff straight to YouTube. So basically all of that content, 55 episodes from season 7 and 8. And what I found is that there were multiple instances where he asks people to donate, whether it's individuals, whether it's actually on behalf of corporations, or whether it's the money that he takes from the show's production budget and funnels into different causes. And so, for example, he asked individuals to give about $15 or so to local food banks. He creates a stamp that you can buy, so like a page of stamps, and all the money goes to postal workers and their retirement fund. Because if you remember, one of the things we started doing during COVID is we ordered a lot of stuff online, right? Because nobody went anywhere. He raised money for healthcare. He raised money for Belarus. These items that he asked people to like buy through donations, they cost about $15 to $20. They sell it really quickly online. It creates kind of this fan community, right? And it kind of becomes this like social media moment for about 24 hours. But he's effectively asking people to donate to causes that he thinks we should care about. He does it with corporations. So he challenges the Pringles. So did you guys know that there's a Mr. Pringle? Like that's actually his name, the guy on the can, right? And we've only ever seen him from, like, it's just his face and his bow tie, right? And so he asked Pringles what Mr. Pringles looks like from bottom down. He gets a lot of fans to engage and draw their own pictures. It gets a little crazy. But in the end, he raises $20,000 with the help of Pringles for community food banks. He does a similar kind of engagement project with Cheerios, where he tries to get them to drop the F-bomb, which they won't because they're a family brand, right? But in the end, between the show and Cheerios, they donate $100,000 to No Kid Hungry, right? And so this idea that he's getting corporations to give money. He also gives money on behalf of the show. So there were like 5 different cities where he had a little museum exhibit. One of them was Baltimore, where I live, so I went to see it, and it really is like 3 paintings. But the idea is museums were places that struggled during the pandemic because people didn't go to museums, right? And so he donates money to the museums, but also to 5 local food banks in those cities. And I think one was maybe Cleveland, there was one in San Francisco, one was in Baltimore, right? And then he also engages with the town of Danbury, Connecticut. Is anyone from Connecticut? Like from the East Coast? You guys all from, okay. So he basically gives them $55,000 if they will name their new sewage plant after him. So he actually goes, because it's during COVID, in this like crazy bubble suit, right? And he has to show up, and they name the plant after him. He gives money to the town and then also to some projects going on in the town, some like donors choose projects for teachers. But this idea that he uses his public platform to raise money for causes that he cares about, right? And he's a political comedian. He's not the leader of a nonprofit. He's not a politician, right? But he's funneling all this money and creating kind of a community of givers. And so he ends up, and this is kind of a rough estimate, but he raises over $5 million for domestic and international causes throughout this like COVID pandemic part of the show, right? He creates fan paraphernalia. I have some stamps at home, right? You could buy the bears, all these other things. It leads to social media engagement and troll-like activism that really encourages financial participation. And we see it in the individual level, so fans participate, right? It's really low cost to participate. It takes like 15 bucks. We see corporations get involved, and we even see him funneling money from the HBO production budget. The barriers to engagement are really like low to non-existent, and it generates all this significant news coverage. And the question I'm really asking is, what does it mean when we rely on a political comedian to tell us where to give our money, right? And where to engage politically. And one of the questions that came up in working on this project was, you know, he's a comedian and he tends to be pretty liberal, right? So he's giving to liberal causes. What happens if there's a host, let's say from Fox, right? And they're trying to generate money for conservative causes. Like, what does it mean when, as a society, we take our cues from where to give our money from political comedians? So that's another way that you can look at political comedy. This was a qualitative project, so I really just looked at the text of all these episodes. I had plenty of time to watch TV because I was stuck at home during COVID. But we can also use political comedy to see how it engages us in terms of fundraising. And I've done a lot of qualitative projects on political comedy and entertainment. Everything from, if anyone followed Mandy Patinkin during COVID on Twitter, I looked at that content. I've looked at work from Sacha Baron Cohen. I looked at the interviews that Governor Andrew Cuomo did during the COVID crisis. He was like the antidote to Trump before he had, again, another Democratic politician who had some scandals. And I've also looked at Stephen Colbert's efforts to try and get people to vote during the pandemic, when we made it really complicated at the state level to get out and vote, and to vote absentee. Any questions so far? Yeah.
So what was the textual analysis done on in the John Oliver example?
So I looked at, literally watched 55 episodes and thematically tried to break down when he was asking for money, was it going to individuals, to the corporation, engaging with the corporations, or on behalf of the show. So the idea is if you look at all the 55 episodes and watch them all and look at the text of the show, you can start to see the pockets where he's starting to get people to give money. And he raises a fair amount of money, right, for all these different causes, and it's really easy for people to just buy this funny thing and in the process give $15 to, their local food bank or things like that. So I want to talk with you a little bit about my work on public opinion. And this is all survey-based. And this is kind of work that I started when I was here as a graduate student. So overall, I've really been motivated by understanding how our political values, so things like ideology, religiosity, partisanship, whether we're a Democrat or Republican, how we engage with media, so what we watch, how much attention we pay to it, and whether or not we share it, and the civic inputs, or the things that we bring to the table, our levels of political tolerance, our feeling about our ability to participate in politics, or our efficacy, and our social contact, like our social networks, how that shapes our behavior. And I've actually kind of used this model to look at public opinion towards a variety of issues. I've done a lot of work on transgender rights and acceptance in same-sex marriage more recently, but things like employment discrimination, rising anti-Semitism, foreign policy issues, science policy. I tend to do this work using large secondary data sets, so survey data sets that other people collect. It's a great way, so if you're a graduate student and it's sometimes hard to have access to data, looking at the Pew Research Center or another organization that collects and makes their data public, it's a great way to engage in a research project. So I've been doing this for a number of years, and one of the issues that I actually started looking at when I was working on my master's thesis here, so back 2006, 2007, was support for same-sex marriage. And one of the things that we know about support for same-sex marriage or gay marriage is that really, despite some conservative opposition as of late, really the opinion climate on that issue has shifted, right? Same-sex marriage became law. You can see this is data from Gallup, I believe. You see 27% support in 1996. By 2022, it's 71%. So really kind of overwhelming broad support for same-sex marriage. There's a few reasons for that. One is generational replacement, so young voters replace older voters. Another is social contact. The people started to know lots of friends who would be negatively impacted, right, by not being able to be married. And so we've seen broad movement and approval for things like employment non-discrimination, for service for gays and lesbians in the military, for second parent adoption, and for fairness in housing. Where we haven't seen as much movement in terms of opinion is on transgender rights. And there's a few reasons for this, right? One is historically the LGBT community didn't have the T, right, included. So there was a lot of friction there in advocating for transgender rights. There's something that we call disgust sensitivity, like that this idea that transgender individuals make people more uncomfortable, right, than gays and lesbians, and this idea that not that many people knew transgender individuals, at least earlier on. And so one of the things that shifted opinion on same-sex marriage was social contact, right? If you don't know someone who's being impacted by some of these laws, you're not as invested in the issue. And so the question became for me was, how can we foster a more tolerant, inclusive political climate for transgender individuals, almost kind of in the same way that we shifted public opinion on same-sex marriage, right? And so what I wanted to do was figure out what media narratives could help move us forward, right? Create more political tolerance with respect to transgender rights. And so one of the things is a work I did with a colleague who's at the University of Delaware. I wanted to understand what narratives or what things could we focus on beyond kind of politics, right, to try and shift opinions towards transgender rights. And so one of the things that we looked at was experience with gender discrimination and also views on gender. Because what we found is that if you're someone who thinks gender conformity in traditional gender roles is really important, you're going to be less likely to support transgender rights, right? The more traditional conception you have of gender, the less open you are to gender being on a spectrum. But what was really interesting is among cisgender folks, particularly women, right, if you experienced gender discrimination yourself, right, if you ever turned down from a job or felt like you weren't treated fairly because you were a woman, right, you had some sort of shared empathy and kind of connection with transgender folks who've been discriminated against. And so what we ultimately did was we looked at a large data set, so Pew data from 2019. Pew does an American Trends panel where they ask Americans about all sorts of opinions, right? And they collect this data. It's all public. So about a year or so after they collect it, they release it. And so you can download it and analyze it. It's great for grad students. But we did this statistical model basically that looked at views towards support for transgender identity and societal acceptance of transgender rights. And beyond kind of demographics and all the things that you normally look at, we looked at views on gender and also experience with gender discrimination. And so even after controlling for all these other things, right, we know that conservatives are less likely to support transgender individuals, right? We know that older individuals are less okay with transgender rights. But really what matters is your views on gender and your experience with discrimination. So if you have traditional gender views, it's not going to help in terms of advancing the cause of transgender rights. But if you yourself have experienced discrimination because of your gender, so you're a woman and someone's discriminating against you for being a woman, you're more sympathetic towards the transgender cause and more likely to support transgender individuals and broader societal acceptance. And so if we use media narratives to focus on the things we have in common, right, our shared experience, in this case, gender discrimination, it leads to more group empathy, and it leads to a more tolerant climate for transgender individuals. So I don't think we're going to see as much of a dramatic shift on this issue as we've seen with same-sex marriage in just such a short period of time. But maybe if we use media content that focuses on the shared experience, we can start to move the needle, right? And so all of the public opinion work that I've done is I've tried to understand how media can help us make things better, right? Because we all become researchers for a variety of reasons. I work at a Jesuit university, which is very kind of social justice oriented, and always tried to use my work to kind of advance things, make the world a little bit better, right? So that's an example of my work on public opinion. I've done a lot on transgender rights. I've done some stuff on anti-Semitism, and even political consumerism. So how do we use our economic power in the things that we choose to buy or not buy, right? The companies that we support versus the places we don't go to, right? Like Chick-fil-A is a great example. How many people, do you guys have Chick-fil-A in Wisconsin? Okay. Like, we have it a lot in Maryland. Does anyone know what's wrong with Chick-fil-A as a business? What?
Sorry, I was being funny.
Oh.
They're pretty homophobic, right?
Yeah, right? They believe in conversion therapy, right? They're also not open on Sundays, which like is a problem when you have children who want chicken on Sunday. We don't get that much chicken because we don't like their politics. But this idea that you can choose to like visit a restaurant or a business that supports your political views or choose not to visit one that doesn't support your political views. And so I've also looked at how, how we spend our money, right, influences politics. So anyway, The last thing I want to talk about, and this is, I know kind of why you guys are all here, life sciences communication, right? Everyone has probably talked about something more science communication-y and I chose to focus on entertainment. But I've done a lot of experimental work with colleagues who all started here on public engagement with science. And so most science humor research looks at what happens when people are exposed to content about, say, climate change or another related issue using either a comedic or funny approach versus a serious approach, right? So how do we engage people on a whole range of science issues if we show them comedy versus news, right? And that's kind of been the focus of science humor research for a long period of time. What I've been doing, and all this work is with folks who I met in graduate school or came here right after me, is we've been looking at what elements or message characteristics shape engagement with science. So we've broken down kind of what types of comedy work better than others, right? Rather than looking at this comedy versus news contrast. And so one of the projects that we did actually was with a friend who was here when I was here. We looked at the difference between one-sided versus two-sided humor. So two-sided humor takes kind of this approach to climate change that it could be human-caused, right, or it could just be these other things, whereas one-sided humor takes a really strict point of view, about human involvement in climate change, this idea that it's more pointed, more satirical versus humor that kind of tries to look at two sides of an issue. I don't think there are two sides to the climate change issue, but a lot of people, beyond the walls of this university do, right, still in America. So we see that a lot in climate humor. And what we find is that one-sided humor, more pointed satirical humor, increases message engagement and also is more likely to motivate people to engage on the issue of climate change. We've also looked at what happens when you watch stand-up comedy that's about science. How many of you guys watch shows like sitcoms, like you've seen Young Sheldon or Abbott Elementary or things like that? Does anyone, historically, those sitcoms always had a laugh track, right? So if you ever watch Friends or things like that, it told you when to laugh, right? And so what we looked at, it was really simple. We looked at a comedian giving a science comedy routine where we included the laugh track that was part of just the audience laughing, and then we removed it. And what we found is that audience laughter really matters, particularly for engagement with science humor, because if other people think that this comedian talking about science is funny, you find it funny, and then you find the source to be more credible, and you're more likely to participate on the issue. And it's a really simple thing, right? But rather than looking at comedy versus news, we looked at stand-up science comedy with a laugh track versus not a laugh track. And then lately, we've been working on some stuff that looks at what happens when you change the source of the message. So when you label someone as either a comedian or a scientist, when you manipulate whether they're male or female, and also whether they're white or black. And what we find is that it really matters that the comedy is funny. It doesn't matter so much if you label someone as a scientist versus a comedian, if they're black or white, or if they're male or female, that the funny or the humor, the greater you are to find the communicator as someone who's pretty effective in transmitting their message. And again, the more likely you are to share the content and also engage on the issue. So it matters more that you're funny and that you enjoy the content than the label of the person telling the jokes or their race or their gender. So this is actually a long line of work that I've really been doing for the past few years, and all these other people. So I'm Amy Becker, right? But Sarah Yao came here, Mike Cacciatore was here, Ashley Anderson was here, and the other person is actually, she works she was at NASA, and now she works for Capital Weather Gang for the Washington Post. So it's also been kind of cool because we've worked with real people who do science communication. But this is all stuff that we all decided to get back together and do some work together, and we've been publishing in this area for a while. So the connections you make here, perhaps even in this classroom, might be still with you 10 years down the road. So what am I doing now? So I went to Brown as an undergrad, and I went back there 2 years to give a similar kind of talk. And I was meeting with the grad students, and they said, well, where do you get your ideas for these seemingly random projects that are, I think, kind of connected? And it comes from all sorts of places. Conversations with friends, conversations in the classroom, things like that. But I'm always looking for new ideas that bring together kind of entertainment and engagement and media. And so what I'm doing now, one is I'm looking at the effectiveness of fictional narratives versus celebrity advocacy on the issue of mental health. So has anyone watched the show Ted Lasso? It's like one of the best shows ever, right? And I think, and also was so important during COVID when we're all stuck at home and here's this like positive guy, right? So the show becomes less about football or soccer and more about mental health, right? And so much so that the cast goes to the White House to advocate for mental health care. And so I'm looking at what happens when you watch the show versus watch them engage, the cast engage at the White House. Doesn't like make people engage on the issue differently. And what I found is like fans of the show really prefer the show. If you know someone who sought out mental health treatment within the past year, so you have like social contact with the issue, you're more likely to appreciate the celebrity advocacy. I'm working on trying to find a home for that piece. And I've also been looking at engagement with comedy. So during the writer's strike, I don't know if anyone noticed, but there was no late night comedy on television. And so the hosts of the 5 big shows, so John Oliver, Stephen Colbert, Jimmy Fallon, Jimmy Kimmel, and Seth Meyers did a podcast. It's kind of hilarious. I recommend it if you need something to listen to on Spotify. But I'm looking at how when you change the medium, how do you still engage the audience? In the area of public opinion, I've been looking at how we can use music as a form of political expression. And the music that we listen to and that we share, what does it say about like our political culture? And I'm also, I just got this grant with a colleague. We're looking at how conversation shapes your faith and your willingness to engage with the election. We're doing a lot to try and figure out how we can get people to engage more and vote, right, in 2024, given what we know about distrust in elections. And then in terms of public engagement in science, we're still looking at the influence of race and gender of the scientific source on communicator effectiveness. So what's cool is like this work with these colleagues who all started here is still ongoing. So I don't really have anything else. I wanted to leave a lot of time for questions because I know that this is probably, like, I'm probably the first person to stand up here and talk to you about Jimmy Kimmel and John Oliver. And hopefully it's things that you, if you're not watching it regularly, because I know nobody watches TV anymore, you're seeing clips shared on social media. So I thought I would leave some time for questions about this stuff or about research ideas or really anything. I know you guys are from a range of disciplines, so.